everyone. I hope y'all are having a wonderful holiday season so far. It is getting cold outside. I'm super excited finally. It's been long enough that we've been waiting for some cold weather. So get in the comments and tell me what your holiday plans are, what you're doing this weekend. Tell me what your favorite part about the holidays is. I'm really, really curious. Mine, I think, is dressing my dogs in cute sweaters and taking them outside and watching them jump around. Get in the comments and tell me who you're with, what your favorite part of the holidays are, and make sure you're opening the William Chris Vineyards 2019 Syrah from Alta Loma. That is what we are drinking tonight. I recommend decanting this. So if you like, while everyone's hopping in the comments and telling me about themselves, grab a decanter. There's a little bit of time before we start our discussion. I have been decanting mine for about 30 minutes now just to see how it's opening up. But you can just toss this into a decanter, give it a little swirl, and then it'll be ready to go. It doesn't need a long time in a decanter, but there's a little bit of funkiness that sits on top of this wine. Something called reduction. It's not a bad thing. It's something that's fully expected in a William Chris wine. And it is in this one as well. So the decanting will help some of the more delicate aromas come out of the wine and fully show themselves. Hi, Leadbetters. All right. So we have people joining in kind of slowly tonight, so I'm going to take my time and just mention to y'all that are joining now that this is going to be the last day that you can purchase the current pack that has this wine in it, next week's wines, and the last 2 weeks' wines that we tasted, the Malbec from William Chris and the Grower Project Sangiovese. Today we're drinking this Alta Loma Syrah from William Chris, and next week we'll be finishing off with the Petite Syrah from Lost Straw Cellars. And this is going to be our last pack for the year. I've had a couple people ask if we are going to continue on this series. And yes, it'll continue on next year. It won't happen through January. So just stay tuned on the normal places where you find out things about us. Email, social media, and if anybody signed up for the text system, you will be texted about when our next virtual series is happening. But I bet this will be a springtime one that happens around March and April. So I'm excited to say that we're going to continue on learning about wine together and drinking wonderful wines. If you're new to this series, we have done, this is going to be our 11th episode. We started this in October. Every single Thursday, we hop on at 6 p.m. and we talk about wine. And every week we've had a different topic. The topic today is tasting terroir. So we have talked about terroir so far in this series. We talked about what it is, but what we don't often get to talk about is how terroir translates to taste, how you actually see, soil translate into a single type of flavor in a glass. And that's what we're going to break down today. So if you have this Syrah, it's going to come in really handy because we're going to do a lot of smelling and tasting this wine as we talk about this topic. And today is the last day to make sure you get that wine so that if you don't have it today, you can watch this episode back and have that wine to taste along with it. All right, let's see who's in the comments saying hi to me. Hi, Kirsten and Will. Having family over for Christmas Eve. That's lovely. Randy and Donna, good to see you guys. John, nice to see you again. And Julie and John, wonderful. Alrighty, guys. We have a small group today, I'm sure, just because it's the holiday. So if you're watching this recorded, thank you for coming back and having a post-session watch through. Always remember that if you're watching this session recorded, I do go back and check the comments to see if anyone had questions from previous weeks that I didn't get to. I do try to answer all of the questions that I haven't been able to get to so far. So just pop them in the comments. Hi, Alta. How are y'all? Wow, lots of traveling, Bee. LS, what happens to the vines in this cold weather? That's a great question. Okay, so we'll start off with a question about what's happening to the vines right now. So vines go through essentially a 4-stage cycle through each of the seasons. The season that we're in right now is obviously winter. This is when the vines are dormant. So in dormancy, all of the vine's energy has been stored in the root system underground where it can retain, some warmth. It is only with warmth that a vine is able to put out shoots, leaves, and then bud grapes. So in the springtime, when temperatures reach above a certain level, that is when the grapes will start to start their process of budding. But while it is this cold outside, the energy is stored underground where it can be preserved and it's warm enough to keep the vine healthy. If it gets too cold, vines can be ruined in places like China where it gets very, very cold and snow hits the ground pretty regularly. They will bury the vines underground to keep a core center of warmth around the vines. We do not get that cold here. So the root systems do all the protecting of the vine. And then all of the wood above ground, it's a couple of years old at least. So it has the ability to keep itself nice and sturdy. Really the risk with temperatures going this low is that there's water in the trunk and in the cordons, which are the arms that kind of reach out where you see grapes grow below. When water is in the top system of the vine, it can freeze and crack the trunk. But all of the water and nutrients and energy is being stored underground right now. All right, so we're drinking the Syrah from Alta Loma today. So everyone open that up, grab a decanter, pour it from one glass to another if you'd like. And let's just taste this together. And then we're going to talk a lot about how terroir has affected this wine and how this wine can possibly taste like any other wine because of the concept of terroir. Let's smell and taste first. So decanting this wine kind of pushes down the aromatics. This is a pretty delicate wine for a Syrah. What comes out when you decant this wine is a texture and some of the more delicate aromas and flavors, like I mentioned. This wine has some personality. It's juicy, it's ripe, and Syrah is always pretty savory. So when you're drinking a Syrah wine, the flavors that the varietal carries with it are black fruit flavors like blackberry, black plum, etc. It has spice notes of black pepper and sometimes licorice. When Syrah is aged, it can get into tobacco and kind of a meaty, savory character. But even in some young Syrahs, you'll get a really, really savory cured meat character or something that goes along with umami. And sometimes, just depending on where the grapes are growing, you can get dried herbs or a plethora of other flavors as well. But black fruit and spices is what Syrah is known for and what we love it for. All right. So I'm getting all of those things. This is black plum, and it's ripe black plum, almost pruny. It's stewed dried fruit. It's really, really ripe stuff. There's that umami character, and it's like a sweet meat. It is that cured meat kind of character that's almost briny and salty. There is dried herb in here. Absolutely. Tons of dried herb, actually. And there's a lovely black pepper note. But it's subtle. It's a little like hint of fresh cracked pepper. And violets. This is a pretty floral wine as well. Not super, super floral, but there is some like dried violet weaving its way through everything else. You get cotton in a lot of Texas wines. I know that sounds crazy, but there's something like really refreshing about like a sea breeze or just a really fresh cotton smell. And I get that with a lot of Texas wine. And maybe that's related to kind of a creamy note. It's just that refreshing, maybe it's a mineral tone as well. I can't put my finger quite on what it is, but it's fun to think about it and play around. On the palate, the decanting really, really brings out the texture in this wine. It's broad, it reaches across your whole palate. It's viscous. There's a little heat to this wine, which I really appreciate. It's 14.5% alcohol. That's why I feel a little like lovely burn right here. This is a wonderful meat wine. If all the things I'm saying are screaming to you brisket, this is the wine for brisket, or like a bison burger or something like that. Despite that heat and that high alcohol, this wine still has a lot of like high notes in it. There is everything on the palate is a lot fresher than it is on the nose. There's actually some red fruit in here. I get like I get red plum on the palate, and I didn't notice that quite so much on the nose. Yeah, there's red and black fruit in here. It's poppy, it's refreshing, but it has a nice weight to counterbalance that. So I could talk and talk and talk about this wine. And I hope that y'all will tell me in the comments what y'all are getting off of this wine as well, because everyone tastes wine differently. And I fully expect y'all to have each a slightly different experience than I'm having with this wine. So tell me in the comments what you're tasting. Everything that we just talked about is defined by this concept of terroir. Terroir, what is it? The expression of place through a wine. So terroir is a French word. It has no direct translation in English. Terroir essentially is all a combination of different factors that happen in a singular place that will affect how the grapes ripen and how they translate in the form of flavor and balance in the final wine. So the things that can affect the place would be things like climate, the climate of a region, the temperature of it, the weather patterns, how much rain the area gets. It can also be how close you are to the equator, how close the sun is to the earth. It could also be the winds that blow through the vineyard, not just the temperature of the wind, but how fast it's blowing, what direction it's coming from, what it's carrying on the wind. This can be affected by things like soil. Soil is a huge part of defining how a place will affect the flavor of a final wine, because it affects how the grapes grow and the types of nutrients that they take in. It can also be affected by things like yeast. If you're using yeast that's naturally occurring on the skin of a grape, that yeast will have a particular flavor, and it's defined by the place that the grapes are growing. So it's all of these many, many, many conditions that affect how the grapes grow. And ultimately, how the grapes grow will tell you what kind of flavors you can get in the final wine. Now, there are many ways to talk about terroir, and one first aspect of it is how large of a region that you're talking about, because terroir can be the terroir of an entire state. It can be the terroir of a single vineyard. It can even be the terroir of a single vine within a vineyard. Every single place where a vine is planted has slightly different conditions than the place next to it. So you can get into micro terroir, like in a cluster of grapes. The grapes at the center of the cluster may vary slightly from the grapes on the outside of the cluster. So we can get into a really micro discussion of terroir here. So know that every change in a place will ultimately affect some facet of the wine, and that can be tasted. What terroir doesn't do is express itself in highly manipulated wines, because ultimately, if you're manipulating a wine, you're removing it just that much further from the place that it came from and how that defines the flavors. For instance, if I take wine and I mix it with cherry syrup, the cherry syrup has nothing to do with the place that the grapes grew. And the cherry syrup may even cover the flavors in the wine that are expressing where the grapes came from. So the places where you can taste terroir the most tend to be those that are working with as minimal intervention as possible. And this can mean less finding and filtering, not dyeing the wines, not adding things to the wine like sugar or acid or tannin or whatever it is. The less manipulation, the more you can taste terroir. So that's a first aspect of it. The second is every varietal has a set of characteristics that it was domesticated for. So for instance, Syrah, no matter where it grows, will tend to have similar characteristics. So a Syrah that's growing in Australia versus a Syrah that's growing in Texas will still tend to have those core varietal characteristics. Black fruit, spice notes, meatiness, all of those are inherent in the variety and how it was domesticated. Ultimately, Syrah was pulled apart and replanted and domesticated in a vineyard so that these characters could be repeated. But no matter what you do, the place where the Syrah is grown will then affect small things, even sometimes major things about the wine, and change the way those characteristics express themselves. So today we're going to talk about the characteristics of Texas and what you should be tasting in a Texas wine that's defined by the conditions of Texas. And know that we're going to talk about Texas as a whole today, and we're going to talk about Alta Loma Vineyard as a singular place today. But from there, yes, the terroir of the Texas High Plains, where Alta Loma Vineyard is very different than the Texas Hill Country. But we're going to generalize things today because we only have about 30 minutes left. All right. Pop in the comments if you have any questions. This is a big discussion today. Oh, Kirsten is drinking the Moonlight Vineyard Blend or the Moonlight Vineyard Mourvedre. Both delicious. Okay, so let me read my notes and make sure that I'm going to say everything that I wanted to say without going over. Okay, so let's start with examples of what parts of terroir can affect what in the final wine. So first part of terroir that we'll discuss is sun. Exposure to sun will affect the photosynthesis of the plant. This is the process of taking water and carbon dioxide through sunlight. They will turn into energy, and this is sugar creation in the final grape. So the more sunlight you get, the more sugar creation you get. The more sugar you get in a final grape, the more alcohol you will have in a final dry wine. So more sunlight will tend to equal higher sugar and more alcohol in the final wine. In the Texas High Plains, we're on a raised flat plain, 3,200 feet elevation at Alta Loma Vineyard. This means that they get tons of sun exposure. They're closer to the sun than they might be somewhere else in the world, in the US, and even versus the Texas Hill Country. So that raised elevation means potentially higher sugar in the final grapes. And because we have a wine that's 14.5% alcohol, we know that there was some elevated sugar in those grapes. This doesn't mean that every single Texas High Plains wine is higher in sugar, but what this does mean is that a Syrah that's growing in the Texas High Plains has the potential to have more sugar buildup in it than the Texas Hill Country. So how does that affect the taste of this wine? That little burn, that little heat that we have is part of the terroir, the sun exposure to the grapes, increasing and elevating the body of the wine and that little bit of warmth. Yeah? Okay. So sun affects many other things, but the alcohol content of the final dry wine is a major one of those. All right. Another thing that can affect is temperature. Temperature, I mentioned that warmth is required for the budding of leaves, shoots, and grapes. Without warmth, none of that grape growing process can happen. So Texas has a really easy time ripening grapes. The higher temperature in Texas we've talked about this before. When temperatures reach high enough levels, the grapes will actually shut down. They won't continue to ripen at 105 degrees. The grapes don't continue to ripen. They shut down and they preserve their energy so they can make sure they can survive past this heat spike. They don't die, they don't shrivel, they just shut down. It's important that when temperatures drop back down to more normal temperatures, like 97 degrees, that water is available to continue on the process. But what those high temperatures consistently do is ripen the grapes. So how this would taste in a final wine is, yes, you will get red or black fruit, but you will get a riper taste from that fruit, because there is a big difference between a super fresh red plum that you bite into and it's a little bit too tart and it's really hard and it wasn't quite yet ready to be eaten, versus a red plum that sat on the counter for a week and has gotten nice and juicy and is at the perfect ripeness. That is a totally different experience with ultimately the same plum. That ripeness level is what the temperature will affect. So from Texas wines in general, you should expect some riper flavors. In white wines, this could mean tropical fruit characters, or dried fruit characters, like a dried apricot maybe. And in red wines, this will mean maybe stewed red plums or dried red plum, or really ripe, juicy blackberries, or even a blackberry jam component, rather than a fresh tart raspberry or a fresh tart blackberry. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't get those fresh cranberry and raspberry flavors from a Texas wine. But if you're getting those flavors off of a Texas wine, you're likely getting grapes from a cooler area. Because the Texas High Plains is elevated, the temperature is a little bit lower at 3,200 feet elevation. So you can expect slightly cool temperatures from North Texas and the Texas High Plains, which is why we get just a nice, ripe, red black plum here. It's stewed, but it's not overly stewed or overly jammy, which is why this wine has heaviness and broadness, but it's still refreshing. It's because we're harvesting these grapes from one of the cooler areas in Texas, in the Texas High Plains. In addition, Texas High Plains is pretty windy, and the wind cools down the grapes, which means that we can retain a bit more freshness, fresh fruit, younger, less ripe fruit characters from the wines. But we are still in a warm climate in Texas, so we should fully expect ripe, juicy fruit from almost every single wine in Texas. Is that what y'all are tasting in the wine? Do y'all get that freshness? Do you get that fresh red plum that's juicy but not yet dried? That is an expression of terroir. So we're getting the classic black fruit characters from Syrah, but they're expressing themselves way different here than they would elsewhere. All right. A big part of terroir, and this is something that's it's tough to talk about, and I've spent a lot of my time in the Texas wine industry figuring out how to talk about the growing season of Texas, because it is fairly short. So our grapes will bud in March, April, and then they will be harvested sometimes as early as July and sometimes as late as September. We've even gotten into October before. It's pretty typical around the world to harvest grapes around September, October. This is typical harvest time. So we're shortening that by a little bit, partially because we have such a warm climate. If you let your grapes ripen for too long, this wine will lose its freshness in Texas, because that warmth is not only increasing the sugar in the grapes, but it's decreasing the acidity. And what we want is a balance of sugar and acidity. So we harvest the grapes a little bit early in order to retain some acidity in the final wine, which provides balance that we need. Now, the length of the growing season will affect many things, but one of the major things that it affects in Texas is the thickness of the skins of the grape. Now, in the skins of the grape, you get color, you get tannin, you get flavors as well. Because our grapes are harvested earlier here than some other places, you'll tend to get a little bit thinner skins. This means slightly less color, slightly less tannin, and less flavor from the skins. There is also, remember, tons of flavor in the pulp of the grape. And this expresses itself, especially when you have less tannin in a wine. That flavor from the pulp isn't covered, and that flavor from the pulp is really, really fresh and very, very juicy. So what we get in a Texas wine is a little bit less color and less tannin, and more optimization of the fresh characters in the final wine. Now, the winemaking process is where a lot of these things can be fully developed. So how long the juice and the skin sit together in the winemaking process will ultimately define how much tannin is in the final wine. But if you look at the color of a Texas wine, often it's pretty light in color. This is because our shorter growing season doesn't develop the skins quite as much. This also means that when you smell and taste this wine, the minerality and the flowers really, really come through. And that is the thickness of the skin not inhibiting all of these fresh, delicate, really elegant aromas in the wine. And this is something that in the last 2 decades, 3 decades since the 90s, we've started to recognize this in the wines, that Texas wines have such elegance because we've optimized the length of our growing season to become a benefit for the final wines. But again, remember that minimal intervention in the winemaking process is one of the other reasons that this is able to happen, that the elegance is able to show itself. Because we've grown these grapes that have delicacy and elegance to them. If we manipulate the wines too much in the winemaking process, if we use too much oak, if we push the wine around too much, heat it up too much, whatever it may be, that can take away some of that delicacy and elegance that you find in a lot of Texas wines now. So smell your wine again, get into those flowers and the minerality of this wine. This wine is really expressive of where it's grown. There's a stone, there's a granite, there's a, I don't know what it is. Wet stone is the aroma that this is most commonly described as. You can get more specific than that, but let's just call it wet stone for now. This is a stony mineral wine with flowers, cotton blossom, and herbs. And the fruit, the fruitiness of the wine, even though it's very ripe, is not covering any of that delicacy up. So this is an expression of terroir, that intense heat and sunlight, then expressed in minimal intervention wine. Awesome. Okay. So next, this one's a big one. Soil. How does the soil actually affect the wine? There are so many ways, and we'll cover only a couple of them here. So soil comes in many different forms. The soil ultimately defines how much water is getting to the vines, because in different soils, water drains at different rates. If you think about clay obviously retains water. When you think of pouring water on clay soil, it turns a deep color and it stays that way for a long time. And it's also cooler to the touch. Clay is a soil that retains water. It can waterlog roots, but it can also keep roots cool. So clay soil in a warm climate can be really, really beneficial because it can cool down the grapes. Sand is quite the opposite. Imagine walking on a beach. You're walking on very, very hot sand that's very, very light in color. It retains heat very, very well. And imagine you're digging through the sand. You dig and there's dry soil. At some point, you're going to hit a pack of wet soil that is nice and cool. So water drains really, really well through sand. It'll drain and then it'll sit at the bottom. And this can sometimes convince roots to grow a little bit deeper to reach the water that's draining deeper. And then you have things like gravel. Gravel and rocky soil drains really, really well. I mean, if you pour water through stones, it's gonna fall right through. This can be very beneficial in very wet areas, maybe closer to the coast of Texas. That would be a benefit. But in the rest of very dry Texas, rocky soil can be pretty dangerous because you lose a lot of water pretty quickly. The other things that rocky soil does is it retains heat. It'll absorb sunlight and keep your vines warm throughout the night. Another thing that's beneficial in a cooler area. So in addition to this process with water, soil is also what gives your vine access to nutrients. And we talked about this in the very first class. The nutrients that your grapevine is getting from whatever soil and whatever area you're in is the same nutrients that the other plants in the surrounding area are getting access to. And this can cause for common aromas between the things that are coming up into your grapes versus the things that are growing around, because ultimately all these root systems are connecting underground, passing nutrients and water to ensure the biodiversity and survival of the trees and other plants, weeds, grass, bushes, etc. around it. So this is how in the Texas high plains, there's tons of desert sage everywhere. The nutrients that's shared in the sandy soils up there is shared with the grapevines, causing the wines grown in the Texas high plains to often smell like desert sage. Stick your nose in this glass and get the desert sage. Desert sage. Absolutely, this wine has it. The Syrahs from Alta Loma, for me, are always some of the most desert sagey wines that we get. And this is the terroir, the nutrients from the soil expressing itself through the wine. This is something that you would not get from another wine anywhere other than a place where a lot of desert sage is growing. So in addition to nutrients and water, soil does even more than that, because imagine the size of the granules of each part of the soil. Clay has really, really fine grains, which is why water kind of is retained there. Sand has a little bit chunkier grains, which is why it's easier to move around and stick your foot into. And then obviously rocks and gravel is much larger and chunkier. All of this will define how thick your root system is and the way it grows underground. This is a part of the reason why people feel that soil affects the impact of the wine. And I'll give you a couple of impacts from soil that I know about and that I tend to find from wine to wine around the world. Clay soil. Clay soil will often give a wine a bold, rich texture. For whatever reason, clay translates to a rich texture. And for me, it's right in the center of your tongue. You get a really, really broad mouth feel. And part of that can be winemaking when you get that broad mouth feel. But clay alone, the grapes growing in clay soil, will tend to carry that through to the final texture of the wine. Versus sand. Sandy soil tends to give you more delicacy in a wine. For whatever reason, sand translates to a softer wine that has more delicacy. This wine is growing in sand. So even though we have a high alcohol wine, Syrah is a big impact grape. We would expect a wine from Alta Loma in the Texas high plains growing in our sandy, loamy soil to be softer than a wine that's growing elsewhere. In maybe clay soil that would give this Syrah a broader, bigger impact. Another factor is limestone, and this is common to a lot of areas in Texas. Limestone will give your wine a higher natural acidity, and it will give your wine access to different nutrients than it would get from another soil. This can often boost the aromatics of the final wine. Now, Alta Loma doesn't have a big limestone influence to it, but the vineyards next to Alta Loma, such as La Pradera Vineyard, which is in the very same county, in Terry County, there's limestone that is in the bedrock. It also breaks up into the soil. And the wines from La Pradera Vineyard, to me, are so aromatic and perfumed. And it is, I think, hugely because of that limestone. Even if it's the same variety, I would expect a Syrah from La Pradera Vineyard to have more of an aromatic impact. And I mentioned this wine, the aromas don't jump out of the glass. Syrah often can jump out of the glass. This one doesn't, and it's partially because of the soil. Tracy, thank you. It is time to take a sip of wine. I love this discussion. It's really hard to, and look at me talking more about it without drinking. Oh, the pepper's coming out. Pepper and like a strawberry rope, strawberry jam. And it's just so shockingly mineral. And there's even like a blue flower to it. I mean, it's a really cool wine. This is just a really cool wine. All right. Kirsten, really good question. So Kirsten asked about limestone versus granite. So limestone I just went into. Aromatic intensity is what I often think about with limestone. With granite, granite is interesting. Granite breaks down into 3 different parts underground. It's been a while since I've thought about the different, it's like formica, and it breaks down into 3 different components underground, and that will affect I don't know. In other places where I drink granite wines, I often find a really steely, stony note that makes me think of really, really cool things. It has a really viscous texture that's very, very smooth and silky. That's what granitic soil does for me. But I'd have to look into what the commonalities across granite soil are. Speaking about a vineyard in Texas, Granite Hill Vineyard, which Bill Blackman planted in 1996. We've harvested grapes from there to make Enchante for many, many, many a year. Granite Hill Vineyard, the wines are soft, but they have a really solid foundation. They tend to be really velvety to me. The Merlots, especially from Granite Hill Vineyard, from the spots that have the most granite there, they're so velvety in texture, but they're not rich like you would get from a clay soil. They're velvety with they just coat your entire mouth without being overwhelming and without being cloying. They're so satisfying. I really need to think about granite soil and how to really define that. But you see, the purpose is the wines wouldn't taste the same from place to place. So there are commonalities across regions, even across single vineyards. So that's soil. The nutrients in the soil, that will affect many things. This will affect the balance of wine. It'll affect the character of the final wine, and it can affect the flavors as well. So the nutrients in the soil, a grapevine doesn't need that many nutrients in order to survive. It actually doesn't need that much water to survive either. But the nutrients in different amounts will give your wine a different impact as well. So for instance, if you think of a wine that's grown from grapes that are from high estate, we know that high estate has really nitrogen rich soil from the turkeys that fertilize the land for us. That rich nitrogen translates to power in the wines from high estate. So even though we have a rocky clay mixture soil at high estate, in addition, that high nitrogen content gives the wine an extra pow and a punch. And this is true of all the nutrients that will that your grapes have access to. It will affect the balance of the wine and the way that it impacts. And this is getting into really, really nitty gritty stuff. Pardon the pun. Water affects everything. Water affects how fast the grapes ripen, how cool the grapes are. It controls temperature, but it also affects the concentration of the flavors in the final wine. So the amount of water won't necessarily give your wine a raspberry flavor or a mineral flavor, but it will define how strong those flavors are in the final wine, because the amount of water that a grapevine has access to will define how many grapes you get off the vine. There are other things that define this as well, but water is a big one of those. Because your grape is a balance of sugar and water and acids and flavors, the amount of water in your grape, whether it's a low amount or a high amount, will determine the balance. Because a grape that has more water in it will have more dilute flavors. A grape that has less water in it will have less diluted flavors. In addition to that, if your grapevine is struggling for water, it won't put out as many grapes because it knows that it can only produce a certain amount of grapes with the amount of water it has access to. The less grapes on your vine, the more concentrated your flavors will be and the smaller your berries will be. And that will not just make this wine plum and dried herbs and violet, it will make it tons of plum and tons of dried herb. Or on the flip side, if you have too much access to water, it can dilute all of that and just give you a little bit of plum or a little bit of dried herb. So the access to water is what determines the concentration of the flavors in your final wine. So in Texas, we have very little access to water. The average, I think, is 30 inches of rain per year, depending on where you are in Texas. That's a pretty small amount. We get highly concentrated grapes here. It's part of the reason that we're talking about Texas wine in the first place, is the conditions that we're growing grapes in is very suitable for concentrated flavors in grapes. And that's ultimately what you want. In order to taste the violet in this wine, the flavors must be concentrated enough, meaning there must be some restriction to the amount of water that the grapes are allowed to have. Now, if everyone remembers this last year, it was very, very dry. We got 3 inches of rain in the entire growing season for some places. That is such a small amount of water. It caused for much less grapes to be grown. I think in some places we lost 40% of the grapes. What this means is we won't be able to make as much wine that year, but what we will be able to make is incredibly concentrated wine. It's going to be really different than what we've seen in previous years because we've had more water in previous years. But that concentration of flavor is something that's going to cause our wines to age longer, to be tastier, to be bolder, to be richer, and to be much more dynamic and exciting. That balance with water is a huge determining factor. And not only that, but when the grapes have access to water will define the concentration. So if you get no rain throughout the entire year and you have really concentrated grapes, and then you get rain 2 days before harvest, your grapes are going to suck in that water and become a little bit more diluted. So timing is also an important factor. But what this means is that the terroir of Texas is concentrated flavor in most years. John, Alta Loma is in Terry County, which is in the Texas High Plains. That's pretty south in Texas High Plains, around Brownfield area, if you know where that is. Kirsten, good question. How much does William Chris water the vines? We water the vines through a drip irrigation system. So it pretty consistently drips water onto the vines throughout the growing season when needed without concentrating the grapes. I do not know in what amount, but I would determine in the right amount that we've learned through all of our horticulture training and many, many years of grape growing. Hi, Mary. I don't know if you know the answer to that. Do you know how much water we give to our grapes? Hi, Catherine. It's okay you're joining late. You can watch this one back. I'm having fun talking about this topic today. It's tasting terroir. And we're almost to the end. So let's talk about the final component that I want to talk about with terroir. The terroir discussion goes on and on and on and on, but I hope that you're seeing through the things we've talked about so far, sun, temperature, water, soil, and nutrients, that all of those things have defined this wine and how this wine therefore could not be made anywhere else in the world. Or in Texas for that matter. This is a singular instance for this wine. And even the year defines the terroir, because different years have different weather patterns. Even though the soil at Alta Loma will stay relatively the same, the climate is general. Weather changes year to year and will mean that this wine cannot be replicated even in the same vineyard, because next year will be totally different than this one. And we saw that this past year when we got very little water for the grapes. Donna, that's a great question. Donna asked, how do you gauge how long a wine can age? Does anyone remember which episode of this series where we talked about how to determine when a wine can age? It was when I was in Houston taking a test. So that means it was in late October. Maybe it was episode 4. Donna, to answer your question very briefly, there are many things that can determine how long a wine can age, but the couple of things that you're looking for are acidity, tannin, sugar content. This wine has no sugar in it, so sugar content should not be considered here. How high the alcohol is, because a wine will age best when it's at medium or low alcohol. High alcohol is pretty volatile. And concentration of flavor. So you don't want to age a wine that doesn't have good concentration of flavor. If you're only tasting peach and the peach is like, I taste a little bit of peach, but not that much, you don't want to age that wine, because 10 years from now, it's going to taste like a little bit of something, but I don't really know what it is. This wine has concentration of flavor. It has good acidity. It has decent tannin, and it has high alcohol. So we'll say this is a wine that should be drunk in the next 5 or 6 years. And I like to talk about wine in terms of every 5 years. This wine I'll give 5 years because most wines can hold on for 5 years, at least the ones made at William Chris. A wine with higher tannin, higher acidity, and maybe a little lower alcohol, I would put at 10 years. But this wine I think is drinking wonderfully right now, and I think it'll improve over the next couple of years, but not too much longer. Oh, Donna, that's okay. You can rewatch it. John, great question. Oh, everyone had great questions. Okay, I'll do Rachel's first just because she put it in before you, and then I'll get to yours, John. When it's more concentrated, is that always a good thing flavor-wise, or needs more planning for production, like how long in barrel? Yeah, Rachel, that's a really good question. So is concentrated flavor always a good thing? Oh, I think that answer is going to change from person to person. And I hate to give a blanket yes. In my opinion, concentrated flavor is something that is highly desired. It doesn't have anything to do with structure. So if you have a ton of flavor in a wine, there's not a lot of ways that can go wrong. I would say it's worse if you have less concentration in a wine, because you're more likely to show flaws in the wine. But concentrated flavors in a wine will hardly ever be flawed flavors that are super concentrated. In the winemaking process, your decisions usually range around structure. So whether the wine has high tannin or not will define how long you want to age it in the winery. But the flavors themselves, I think the desire pretty generally is to have concentrated flavor. Now, there are certainly many producers who are not trying to go for concentrated flavor, because concentrated flavor is not always appreciated by the consumer. There are many people like myself who enjoy a really casual wine that doesn't have a ton of concentrated flavor. Like a Pinot Grigio is a great answer. There are some really concentrated Pinot Grigios and Pinot Gris out there. And then there are some just simple, really crushable, really tasty Pinot Grigios that I don't expect to have more concentrated flavors from. But if I took that same Pinot Grigio that was pretty simple and a little peach and a little lemon and not much else, and I made it more concentrated, I don't see any way that would be a bad thing. I always want more from the wine. I'll give one example that I think it would be bad to have concentrated flavors. But this I think has less to do with the concentration of the flavor and more to do with the characteristic of the grape variety. There's a grape variety called Carmenere that has very green bell pepper flavors to it. It's really green and grassy and herbaceous, which can be a wonderful thing. But in too high of an amount, a really concentrated Carmenere can be very unattractive. But only if the Carmenere was not ripened fully. When you have a fully ripe Carmenere, a really concentrated green bell pepper aroma can be very, very lovely, as long as it's balanced out by a high concentration of fruit or something else. So it really, really just depends. That's a really good question, and I don't think I answered it, but hopefully some speculation helped you think about it more. John, how does our terroir match up to California and Europe? Terroir changes from state to state, to country. It also changes in really, really small amounts. And this is where we get into the last part of our terroir discussion. And this is tradition. What is the tradition in the particular place that we're growing grapes in? This is a part of terroir because tradition is found in place. So the tradition in Texas for making wine, our tradition is still pretty young. So our terroir is experimentation. It is oak right now. We oak a lot of our wines. They match up beautifully with the concentrated flavors of the wine. You'll also find some really, really ripe, fruity wines that are very, very juicy and higher in alcohol. That is right now a tradition in Texas, and we're still crafting those. Now think about the tradition in California. They have a lot of sunshine. They have a lot of warmth valleys that they're growing wines in. They have really, really ripe, fruity flavors. They tend to oak their wines to match up with those flavors. And so there's a specific style and flavor that can point you towards California, not just because of the flavors in the grape, but because of the flavors from oak that is commonly associated with California. And then look at Europe, that has hundreds, thousands of years of tradition in making wine. They make their wines to be food friendly, acid driven, sometimes bitter in youth so that they can soften out over time. There is a certain amount of oak aging that's associated with European wines, depending on where you are in Europe. Those wines, you can tell where they were grown and where they were made, partially from what the grapes taste like, how ripe the characters are, et cetera, but also because of how they were treated in the winemaking process. There are a lot of French and Italian wines that have an inherent funkiness and minerality to them because they are minimal intervention. They're going for food-friendly wines. They don't want too much fruitiness on their wine. So their terroir is defining their wines completely differently than somewhere like California. And Texas kind of falls in the middle. This is a large topic because tradition is something that's practiced in every place, everywhere. Part of our tradition in Texas is the food that we eat. Barbecue, we're making wines that pair to barbecue because that's what we're going to be eating for dinner and for lunch the next day. And we're going to be having leftovers the day after that. That defines the way we craft the wine because we know that it will ultimately often be pairing to food. Never discount the influence of tradition on terroir and how a final wine will taste. You can call this wine, this reductive, funky, fruity wine that needs to be decanted to open up and show its elegance. You can call that the terroir of William Chris Vineyards. That is something that we practice based on the place that we're at, the food that we're pairing it to, the things that we've learned from the winemakers around us. That is something that is defining our wines and defines every producer's wines, where they came from, what they learned, and the food that they're pairing their wines to. Ultimately, our goal with the wines is that once you decant them, once you swirl them, once you hold on to them and let them age in bottle and interact with oxygen, the wine will blossom like a flower. Sorry, I did that wrong. It'll blossom like a flower. So our wines are balled up in bottle. Once you put it in the decanter, in the glass, it slowly starts to unfurl. That is part of the terroir that you can taste in every wine. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. All right, let me see if I missed any questions. If you have questions before we hop off, remember to post them in the comments because I'll go back and I'll answer them next week, which will be our last episode with the fall semester wine school because we're in winter. So you'll have to come back around in the spring. We'll be having another series just like this next year. You know where to find us and get that information. So keep checking in on your emails. Subscribe to our text chains that will send information out to you. Check our shop pages for any virtual packs that we have going on, and check our social media pages. We will make sure that the information gets to you so you can join us on the next series. John, that's a great point. It would be fascinating to see what a French winemaker in France would do with Texas grapes. I assure you it would be something really cool because Texas grapes have the capacity to make many, many things and make beautiful food-friendly wines. Mary, you heard that we were irrigating regularly towards harvest and saw them dripping, but never had before. You've never seen the drip irrigation system before? I know that it was something that we changed recently. We added more drip systems. John, I'm not sure what you mean by our Texas wines take a hit because we're Texas as well as new to the worldwide wine scene. We're not that new to wine, actually. The winemaking tradition in Texas started in the 1650s, and we have maybe not as much experience making wine as somewhere like Europe. We don't have thousands of years behind us, but we have a lot of experience with agriculture, and this contributes to the excellence of Texas winemaking in many areas, and grape growing as well. So don't discount the tradition here. I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, but the tradition of Texas is experimentation and perseverance. The winemaking tradition is experimental because we can do whatever we want to define the style of Texas wine, and we're still finding out how to celebrate best these thin-skinned grapes that have a lot of spice character and a lot of ripe fruit, but also elegance. I mean, there's a winemaking style that will center around the grapes that we have. Mary, you're yelling at me. Merry Christmas, Tracy. I'm glad you'll be there next year. Okay. Mary, you knew they were there, but assumed they dripped when you weren't working. Yeah, the drip irrigation system doesn't just continuously drip throughout the year. I mean, we have a lab technician for a reason. They're taking in the grapes and assessing where they're at and what they need at the time. Grape growing is a really, really labor-intensive process where we watch the process like a hawk to make sure that the grapes are getting access to what they need when they need. And part of the terroir of Texas is unpredictable seasons. We get rain at weird times, hail at weird times, freezes in weird years, temperature spikes, temperature lows. All of that means that we're watching the grapes. So that drip irrigation system, it doesn't need to be used that long. We don't need that much water for the grapes, just enough. Okay, John, I've got you. John, thank you for being so active in the comments. You asked wonderful questions. And thanks for all of the interaction and questions today. I know we went over, but it's just because you guys, I love the questions that you ask and I want to answer them all. But I will let y'all go. I'm sure that many of you are with family now or pets and kids and friends and whatever, and want to be enjoying time with them. So I will let y'all go and see y'all next week with the Lost Straw Cellars Petite Syrah. We'll talk about why Petite Syrah and Syrah are not the same thing next week. This is the 2019 vintage from Varasian Hills. So I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about how that wine was made from the very beginning when the vines were planted to the very end. Merry Christmas to all. Happy holiday. Have a good weekend. I'll see y'all next week. Bye, guys.